Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on our webcast. My name is Dean Evans, and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Events here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm so excited to introduce you for today's presentation, and it is, are your third-party vendors exposing your organization to cyber threats? Our presenters for today's webcast, we have Nick Hayes, who's a Senior Analyst at Forrester. Nick is a frequent speaker at leading industry events and does extensive research and commentary for many major media outlets across the globe. We also have Eric Olson, who's our Vice President of Intelligence Operations. He's the Senior Cybersecurity Executive and Product Development Expert here at LookingGlass. Eric and Nick are going to be giving us a good overview of third-party risk landscape and offer some insight into where the industry is moving, as well as some alternative approaches to third-party risk prevention. Very, very exciting stuff. Just a very few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. I want to run you through these for the BrightTalk platform. Please make sure, audience members, that you note that there is a chat feature on your screen. If you have any questions for our presenters, please be sure to submit those through that feature here on BrightTalk, and we will address those at the end in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. If we happen to run out of time, feel free to go ahead and keep sending those in, and we'll make sure to address it after the presentation. Also note that the questions can only be viewed by our presenters. So if there's anything that you would like addressed directly after the presentation privately, be sure to note that, and we'll make sure to do so. There's also a link there for some attachments and some great resources on third-party risk, some great content that you can download at your convenience. So without any further delay, let me go ahead and pass this over to kick off our presentation. We have Nick Hayes with Forrester. Nick?
Hi, thank you very much. That was a great intro. I'm really excited to be here to talk about third-party risk. It's a really interesting time to be talking about this. I think third-party risk has been an area we've all, been worrying about recently due to a number of different issues, from Equifax to the ransomware attacks earlier this summer and spring. But overall, just a lot going on, not just in terms of how or what is actually taking place and the risk getting worse, but also in terms of what we can do to actually take more proactive steps to mitigate those risks. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about, and I hope you get a lot out of it. To start off with just some of the challenges that we see taking place in the market. Recently with Petya, non-Petya, and WannaCry, we've just seen major ransomware attacks take down huge swaths of businesses and partner ecosystems. And what happens when ransomware hits these organizations, like FedEx, like Maersk, like Mondelez, these are third parties that are potentially very central to the way that your organization is operating. So when they go down, it hurts your business and disrupts your overall ability to meet performance goals, to meet performance metrics. Secondly, it also puts your own data at risk. We saw this earlier with issues like Netflix and HBO, where content was stolen and then held for ransom in a different type of extortion technique. But the way they actually got the data, the attackers got the data, wasn't from HBO. It was actually from one of its third parties that was doing some post-production work on some of the films that they were working on, particularly Game of Thrones. I'm a big fan of the show, so was interested to see how that actually affected the organization. But this can take place not just with HBO, but with any organization where you have sensitive information that you're transferring to other partners, as well as other infrastructure. And then in this third example is the CC Cleaner malware that was actually embedded into trusted vendors, and many devices ended up downloading this malicious malware that was embedded in a trusted application. So these types of issues are affecting and could be apparent in your own environment just because of the trusted applications that you have within your ecosystem. And So beyond these types of actual events, what's taking place? These are the challenges that we're actually facing with. Sure, there's these other events that we can point to and talk about what's going wrong, but these are the challenges that we're facing today as security and risk leaders. Third parties are just proliferating. They're more critical to the business than they've ever been. They're just a huge portion of the way that our organizations are operating and, again, able to perform and continue to grow. At the same time, because of that proliferation, there's an increasing reliance on them to actually build the business in the right ways. And then risk events are getting worse. The impact when you have a data breach or a cyber attack or really any other event, there's the impact of the downtime and of the reputational issues are getting even worse. Companies are incurring worse and worse costs, the rates and cyber insurance going up is also a key sign of this. And then thirdly, just how we deal with third parties. Right now, a lot of organizations, we're still thinking about manual process and assessments, questionnaires, and this is hurting both the third parties that you actually reach out to, as well as yourselves, who I'm sure are getting inundated with your own RFP requests. So right now, it's long and resource-intensive processes that are slowing down our ability to manage all these third parties. And then because of that, we have inconsistent data and incomplete or untimely responses. It takes third parties longer to get that back. They might not fill out all of the questions in the way that you would like, and they may make mistakes either on purpose or unintentionally. But in either case, it leads to an area where there's major gaps in your oversight that you have to find ways to augment that with other independent external data. And then lastly, the external factors that influence your risk posture are also just continuing to expand. Geopolitical issues, nation-state actors, as well as other, geopolitical events like Brexit. These things are affecting the way that your organizations are operating and the way that you interact with third parties. And then thinking about the number of legal and regulatory issues that are coming up, everything from GDPR to the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity regulation to the U.S. Office of Comptroller of the Currency. All of these are have third-party ramifications, and some explicitly go into the actual issues and requirements that you have to meet in order to meet them. So with all of that, what do we do? How do we bridge this gap? I think I've talked and highlighted about many of the things that you are seeing and going through. But what do we actually do between all this lack of information, the challenges that we face, and the growing risks? Well, the real answer is curly fries. Okay, this is just a joke, and I'm sure for the people that are listening in right now, it may be getting you hungry if it's lunchtime for you. It's lunchtime for me, so this is definitely making me salivate a little bit. But the actual story behind this slide is I wanted to point this out because it's all about building context. And there was a really interesting study that the University of Cambridge did a year ago or so. And what they did was they looked at Facebook information and were able to identify and prove that people that liked curly fries on Facebook were more likely to have a high IQ. Now, of course, this doesn't mean if you go and like curly fries that your IQ is going to be any higher than it was a minute prior. But the point here is that you're pulling out all of this context to help make a better decision about people or about third parties. And so thinking about what are the curly fries for your third parties that you can start to take out. That's what we want to start thinking about, and maybe get some snack for this afternoon for lunch, or for after lunch too. So that's where risk intelligence, adding this external context, is just critical. We have to start monitoring on a more consistent basis and looking for other information to make better decisions. And it's not something that you can necessarily develop directly. You have to pull together a lot of different data, a lot of different attributes to make and understand how different entities are related to each other, the interactions that are taking place, and how likely the entities are actually associated with your company or with your third parties. So being able to perform different types of advanced analytics, data clustering, machine learning, all those buzzword bingo elements that actually do have real value behind them. Being able to apply that to better assess and better understand both who are the third parties that are working with you and how can you use that data to better understand your risk exposure with them. So this is why vendor risk monitoring and scoring is really important. When we start looking at technology, being able to do a lot and being able to pull important information and being able to pull out that context, it's going to require a technical solution to really be able to do this in the best way possible. And so the reason for it is that it provides a quick overview of your third-party cyber risk exposure without the need for vendor interaction up front. So it expedites a lot of the process and helps you prioritize where you need to spend more time immediately. It identifies risky relationships for you to prioritize reviews and even can suggest mitigation tactics based on the type of information and the areas where the security of your third parties might not be up to the standards that you want. And thirdly, it validates vendor-provided information. So double-checking and verifying that the information that your third parties end up providing matches what you see from their responses is definitely a key way that you can help apply this type of risk intelligence. And moreover, you can start to fill in the gaps and work on any areas where there may be a disagreement. And then lastly, you can start to benchmark your third-party risk posture against your competitors or against industry norms to help better understand where you need to be, or basically another metric to show how well you're performing. So behind the scenes, how they work, and you probably have a good sense of this already, but I think it's worth talking about because each step here is actually very important and very difficult to do, and should be part of the way that you review any vendor that you consider as you start to think about the solution that you want. The first part is the data collection. So how you're actually scanning and aggregating and analyze and pulling all this information from different places on the web, the dark web, as well as different types of honeypots and other OSINT as well. All that's critical, and some of it, every vendor has different techniques and different strategic partners that help fill out this information. But getting a sense of where that data is coming from and how deep it is definitely a very important step. But then the second part is equally as important because the analysis and the normalization of the data is key to making sure that you only get relevant events and that the attribution and the actual events that get pushed to you are related to your third parties or to your organization. So reducing that noise is a key piece of this, as well as making sure that you have good ways of actually making sense of the data that's coming in. If you have all of this data, big data coming in, it's not helpful unless you can actually start to parse it out. And then the second piece of the analytics is once it's normalized, you still have to understand and assess it based on risk. You still have to understand, okay, now that we have this third party, we know the attributes, we have a better sense of its environment, but what are the issues? How well are they performing security, and how much of a risk exposure are they, both from a security standpoint as well as from a business standpoint? How frequently are you doing business with them? What's the criticality from a business perspective as well as from a security perspective? And ultimately, that translates into a final rating so that you can help determine where you need to prioritize. So vendors that end up having higher risk scores or basically have lower external security appearances are certainly more likely to be a higher risk to your organization. Again, just like like in my analogy to curly fries, it's not saying that that the vendor is necessarily going to have a data breach or not. It's saying that it's more likely that these vendors that have a higher risk score will be more susceptible to a risk event. So when you start to think about selecting vendors, these are the things you'll want to focus on. I mentioned and talked about data access. And the second part is that certainly the data gathering techniques, which are both part of the data collection process, as well as penetration. Data penetration, thinking about different channels where it's difficult to get access to different types of, particularly thinking about the dark web, thinking about places where chatter talking about or coordinating different types of attacks can take place, and being able to identify how that relates to either your organization or, again, your third parties. And then the frequency, thinking about mostly about the scanning rate, so how frequently, for all the data that can be gathered, how frequently is it getting pulled in and refreshed? And the other piece of this is, if you are receiving it in a report format, how often are you going to be seeing those? I think the first portion of this, in terms of the scanning, is certainly something that you want done for almost all areas more frequently than quarterly, and probably more frequently than monthly. And then the transparency. I think this is a key aspect for vendors. Those that are not hiding behind a veil of, calling it their secret sauce and not helping you understand what they're doing and how they're doing it to the degree that they can. So really thinking about how granular they are in terms of how they're performing the other steps that we just went through. And then six, configurability, how easy it is to adjust weightings and set risk tolerance. If you're more worried about specific vendors or specific types of risk, whether it's application security, patching cadence, or even higher levels of risk, let's say it's regulatory risk, or you're worried about data privacy, for example, being able to identify those types of risks and adjust them is certainly something you'll want to look at so that you're alerted and help set the right prioritization methods. And lastly, what's the actionable output? What's the rating relevance? How helpful are the mitigation recommendations that the vendor is offering? Okay, so you have the scores, and then what do you do with it? And this is actually a key piece that you have to really focus on. Really thinking about what you do once you know that you have a risky vendor. And this is not always an easy process. Many times CISOs end up in difficult conversations with very strategic vendors that they work with about needing to improve the security standards. And the organization or the third party not understanding where this risk score came from, if it's actually valid, where the, arguing differences, threatening to, close business. Like these are very difficult problems. So making sure that you have a repeatable process, that you have the right type of decision tree and overall kind of templates to have collaborative conversations that open up the review process for you to help your third parties actually improve their security, so it actually works on both sides. You end up more secure because your third parties are actually taking steps to further improve their own security posture. And then finally, not finally, actually I have a few more pieces of advice for you. But here, think there are additional ways that you can leverage third-party risk intelligence. So you're onboarding vendors faster, right? You're discovering hidden third parties that you might not have realized your business is actually working with, part of thinking about shadow IT, for example. You can verify other GRC data in GRC platforms and investigate major discrepancies. You can review your own scores to benchmark and inform your own security strategy. Maybe you find that after a review that your external security posture isn't enough, and you want to and need to improve certain elements of your own security organization. this is also a key way that you can actually track a security metric for your executive and board reporting. Being able to show on historically how what your organization is doing from a security perspective and how it looks on an ongoing basis is not going to be the only metric that you show, but it's a very valuable additional one that your executives will likely get very quickly. And then you can, if you have a high score, it will help during cyber insurance negotiations because many of the carriers are actually using these same types of data analysis techniques. So being able to show and prove that you have higher security scores can actually help in your negotiations. But overall, the biggest part is helping make the right decision. I'll never but sorry, I skipped the slide there. So is making the right decision. So when you're going through, the key questions that you'll want to consider are, what risk data do you need to make better decisions? How will that data help inform what you'll do next, how you'll mitigate the risk or remediate the events? And what do you know what's really at stake? Meaning, how critical is it to the business? How much time and how, are your tier 1 vendors versus tier 2 versus tier 3? Do you have that type of ability to separate and categorize those vendors? And then are they really in the right areas? Being able to have that information, again, helps you make those decisions. Because as I was alluding to, it really is all about making better informed cyber risk decisions. I'll never forget when I saw this quote from the head of Sony Security. This was a quote prior to the breach that took place, where he said, "I will not spend $10 million to fix a $1 million problem." Now, this was more hyperbole. It wasn't actually the real dollar numbers in place here, but it shows that he was undervaluing security, undervaluing the business and the data that he was protecting, and as a result, Sony suffered dearly. So we have to start parsing out all of these different cost elements, all these different areas in which the organization is actually suffering and incurring costs when a cyber attack takes place. This is an example of a case study of a health insurer who incurred a major data breach and showing where the actual costs were for the organization over a 5-year period. What's really telling is that only about 6% are in those tangible costs that your cyber insurance policy actually covers. So all the remediation, the incident triage, the immediate operational disruption, that was 6%. The remaining 94% were in reputational issues, were in these under hidden costs related to the organization. 50% wasn't actually losing customers, it was losing contract value of customers, having to offer discounts because customers were negotiating based on trying to keep the clients happy after the breach. They did lose another 26% of those costs were due to lost customers. And then devaluation of trade name, increased costs to raise their own capital, and then they also suffered and had to pay higher insurance premiums because of their overall issues and overall risk exposure. So what I want to leave you with are some key takeaways, some recommendations that I hope you that you take away from this presentation, if nothing else. First, scrutinize vendor SLAs and avoid vendors that hide behind that veil of secrecy and unsubstantiated, quote-unquote, proprietary techniques. Tier vendors by business criticality and monitor them accordingly. Pay more attention to the businesses that are obviously more important to your organization, that represent bigger dollar values, or not necessarily just dollar, but more valuable and sensitive data that it's transferring. Thirdly, set your own risk tolerance levels, and establish formal processes to work with third parties and remediate unacceptable risks that could potentially threaten ongoing business with that third party. And lastly, make the most of the data and analysis. It's on you. It's on us as security and risk professionals to really take this into our own hands, to make sure that we're working with our third parties more actively and finding ways to help make our organization more secure from our extended enterprise. So with that, I just would like to thank you, and I'll turn things over to Eric.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thank you everyone who's listening. I'm excited to talk to you today, and to put it bluntly, I couldn't have asked Nick for a better placement of the ball on the tee for me to swing at with the bat, because for those of you listening, Nick, as an industry analyst, has a very broad perspective on what the industry is looking for, what the industry is telling him, and I'm sort of an everyday practitioner who's got his head down in the weeds talking to individual customers. And what I find really shocking in listening to Nick's discussion is how almost verbatim the things that he is saying from the big picture perspective mirror what we are hearing from every customer that I talk to. In fact, I will tell you, before I ran our intelligence operations, I was for a number of years in charge of product development at our company. And I have never been in a situation where, before about the last 8 months, in which we go talk to customers, we go to trade shows, we meet with prospects, we go to industry confabs, and everybody wants to talk about the same one thing. And right now, for the last calendar year roughly, that one thing has been third-party risk. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is jump into my prepared presentation. But I think you all will see, as I do, that what Nick is seeing from his top-down perspective on a whole industry as a professional analyst, and my very bottom-up perspective as a guy turning individual wrenches with customers, the convergence of what we're hearing and the consistency of it is really remarkable. So I won't spend a lot of time on the first slide or two. They actually make points that Nick made very, very nicely in his remarks. But I wanted to point out one thing that this sort of torn from the headlines. I think we all know that breaches and hacks and bad things are happening. We are now at the point in history where these things are in even the mainstream press every day. What I think is interesting about some of those torn from the headline stories are that the targets range across the defense industrial base, entertainment, consumer electronics, mining, heavy equipment, aviation. There's no industry that isn't being touched by this. And as many of those headlines will now tell you, again, if you see it in the mainstream press, you know it's really become a thing, which is that the third parties, the supply chain, the vendors, the outsourced service providers are increasingly, and now by these graphics, the majority of the points of origin. As some of you out there may have heard, there's a phrase that I really like in this age of outsourcing and third-party services, which is, there is no cloud, it's just somebody else's computer. A statement I really, really like, because there is certainly merit that folks who get up every day thinking about nothing but providing those cloud infrastructures may do a much better job than many smaller enterprises, certainly, at securing your data. But they also place a huge target on their back because, your company may have 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 employees' HR information in Workday or UltiPro or any of these third-party cloud-based personnel systems. The problem is that they have 100 other customers like you, which means they have 1 million records, which makes them a big fat target. So they better be on their game because you have entrusted your sensitive information or critical business operations or both to that third party or cloud-based provider. And as we see in headlines and charts like this one, increasingly it is not the enterprise where the IT or information security team may say with hand on heart, that we are absolutely locked down tighter than a drum, and they may even be right, although the statistics are that they aren't. The problem is that, half your sensitive stuff, half your sensitive data, and half your critical operations no longer run on your network, and that is a significant source of exposure. So in concept, the notion, at least from our perspective here at LookingGlass, and I'm here to give you our take and our approach on how we bring together a solution for this type of concern. It is conceptually simple, deceptively so, and that can be really challenging when working with customers because the devil, as we'll see in a moment, really is in the details. But conceptually, it's very simple what we want to do. We need to combine the identifiers or information that correspond to your third-party vendor universe. That is the network elements, the IP addresses, the domains, the mail servers, all the things that are points of access or public-facing, and therefore we mean attacker-facing infrastructure that correspond to your vendor. So you need a list of vendors, and you need to overlay on that a complete topology or internet footprint that allows you to accurately identify the network assets and points of exposure that correspond to each of those vendors. Given the ability to say, of all the things connected to the internet, these are the things that correspond to each of the vendors I care about, you then need to simply overlay sources of accurate, vetted, credible threat intelligence, and where those three things overlap, conceptually, something should go ding and make you aware of a risk. The devil in the details, as I said, is that it's much more complicated in each of these areas when you have to drill down and operationally make it happen. So just to give a very simple example in each area, for internet topology, it is no trivial undertaking to maintain the routing data, DNS information, and topology and geolocation information that says, here's everything connected to the internet and who it belongs to and where it resides. In fact, LookingGlass was originally founded on the commercialization of exactly such a technology that was originally developed in and for the government. The second piece of that is it is non-trivial in many cases to accurately fence or identify the network assets that belong to each of your many vendors and overlay that on the internet topology map so you can say what belongs to whom. And finally, in a market awash in so-called threat intelligence, much of which is not really intelligence, it's data, but there are a lot of feeds, there's a lot of unstructured content, there's social media, there's the dark web, and so to actually put these things together in a credible way has a lot more moving parts than the conceptual diagram would indicate. Part of what we bring to the table, and what I think LookingGlass has done really well, is through its almost 20-year history, is develop the actual capabilities to do all of the things that I just described. And I'll go into that in some more detail. But the notion is that we actually have the ability in a single organization to bring those three things together in a credible way. So let's talk a little bit about how to approach and implement an effective risk external monitoring solution for risk from your third parties. First, as Nick touched on, I am, prior to my 18 years going on this week, 18 years in intelligence, I was once upon a time a Big Four accounting firm bean counter, and that part of me still says risk management is about understanding both the potential impact and the likelihood and understanding where to prioritize the real constraint, which as an 18-year practitioner in the security industry, I can tell you every customer I talk to, even the ones with budget, even the ones with all the cool toys and technologies, face one critical constraint, which is the availability of time from the very scarce people who know how to do this. The talent shortage is actually more serious for many of our customers than budgetary constraints, and those are always a reality. My point is that you have to tier your vendors and understand where to spend your resources, both financial and human, in order to get the most mitigation of risk bang for your available person buck. And there are lots of frameworks and traditional disciplines around risk management. But to sum it up, not all vendors are created equal. What they have access to, what methods they use to access it, and how much damage it would do to your business if they were breached, surveilled, or otherwise hacked is something you have to evaluate in order to know which vendors and risks warrant the cost and the human time of an external risk management or third-party monitoring program. So with that in mind, we think it's very important to say, okay, there are some folks that I should probably check once a year, make sure I'm in compliance, I'm filing the right papers, and I'm doing what I am required to do. Check the box on those and look for anything egregious. A periodic or historical analysis that says, as of today, here's what I can tell you for the last month or quarter or a year. It's often annual in my experience. There are some vendors where that is about right and enough, not because more wouldn't be better if we could do it, but because the risk that that vendor presents just doesn't justify higher cost monitoring or levels of effort. You know, if a vendor supplies you with paper goods and coffee cups, you may be required to check on them once a year, but the risk that they're going to expose the blueprints to the stealth fighter is pretty low. Excuse me. At the other end of the spectrum are the vendors who are constantly in direct connection with your sensitive data, your customer data, financial information, unreleased filings or results, or customer health, PHI, PII, or the blueprints, the stealth fighter. These are cases where that 24/7 continuous monitoring and notification of risks and concerns as close as possible to real time is actually justified. What we want to do is bring to the table a spectrum of capabilities, and this is how our offerings work, is a spectrum of capabilities that says we will meet you where you are and apply the right level of scrutiny, monitoring, and cost to each of your tier of vendors. The last thing I want to make sure I mention here, because as I said, the critical constraint we hear from customers, I was with one for a couple of hours yesterday on this very topic, is that the most painful constraint they suffer from is not having the people to do the work. And so we don't believe that this solution stops at ratings or scorecards or data feeds or information, even if that is easily integrated into your GRC tools, your dashboards, your SIMs, or other products and systems. We believe that a real solution includes a service element where you can actually call on people who know what they're talking about and ask them questions. How did this come up? What does this mean? How do I approach the vendor? What should I say? Do you have any recommendations for how to mitigate this? Do you have a methodology? You do this all day, every day. What's the three-ring binder that tells me how to work with what you are reporting to me? And that human component, that service component, is what many of our customers and prospects are telling us is really missing or more important for some tier of critical vendors than those automated scorecards or simple data reporting services. So the third-party risk monitoring service that we have assembled brings together those key elements that I described that are conceptually simple and devilishly difficult to do in operational reality. As I mentioned, LookingGlass was originally founded in part on that mapping of everything connected to the public internet. We have developed the systems that allow us to take a legal entity name, a common name, a website or domain name, and reverse into the actual entity that controls that network asset or logical or cyber asset, and say, here are all the domains, mail servers, CIDR blocks, ASNs, IP ranges, and internet-connected things, that is essentially access points or attack surface for a bad guy, and overlay those two things so that we can accurately map the assets belonging to your enrolled vendors. On top of that, we then overlay nearly 100 vetted, carefully selected, and measured for quality feeds in the structured threat data marketplace, if you will. About a quarter of those come from LookingGlass, and 50 plus others come from credible, reliable third-party, either commercial vendors, government sources, or open source communities and blacklists. And we overlay that along with collection of unstructured user-generated content and open source intelligence from social media, known threat actors. We track about 6,000 of those continuously. The surface web search engines, deep web, dark web, underground forums, IRCs, and the like. Bringing together the best of both structured and unstructured threat intelligence and layering that onto your vendor universe, what we get as a result is a set of incident types or findings that cross that spectrum from traditional cyber, I see evidence of a virus infection, to non-traditional. So without taking you through some of the granular incident types or exposures that the service reports on, I'll give you one very simple example that is not covered, and this ties to one of the questions already submitted by the audience. But people say, for example, well, there are frameworks, there's ISO certifications, there's NIST framework, and so on for cybersecurity. Here's one where I have not seen, I'm not aware of any actual hard standard because it's incredibly difficult to apply. For instance, the registration of lookalike, character reversal, character substitution, and typo squatting domain names is one of the most effective TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, from which to launch a spear phishing email, which either drops a malicious payload or, increasingly, just plain hornswoggles the user out of wiring $50,000 to a vendor that doesn't exist, mailing out W-2 forms, or accidentally sending the wrong person the blueprints to the self-fighter. There is no standard that I am aware of that tells you how to monitor across more than 1,000 top-level domains for suspicious-looking domain names, how to tell whether or not and to what degree they smell funny, because it's just a string of characters if you don't look at, is it hosted yet? Where is it hosted? Who registered? What do we know about them? What do we know about the box it's on? Do we know anything about the provider? There is no standard for this yet. Those lookalike emails, which, by the way, can pass DKIM and other checks for spoofed senders, because the domain is the domain it's supposed to be. It's just not the one the casual user thinks it is. There are no standards around these things. Yet it is a critical, given the current state of effective TTPs, this is a critical thing to watch for. So some of it is standard cyber stuff. Do you see evidence of an infection on a web server or a vulnerability in an application? But some of it, especially the unstructured open source intelligence, like hacker chatter and bad guys in an underground forum, leaking pre-attack indicators talking about the political or ideological reasons they would like to hack that company tomorrow and how they might go about it. Those are things for which there is less a hard and fast methodology, but they are a critical part of effective monitoring, at least in our perspective, by bringing together both that structured and unstructured intelligence. And finally, and this is a key I think, discriminator in a managed service versus a scorecard. Everything you see on this screen, every candidate finding, every potential incident is then vetted, validated, annotated, and published after verification by a trained analyst in a manned 24/7 center that is at the desk. We call it our watch desk, 24 hours a day on every day, including Christmas and New Year's. What customers complain about most often with automated services and threat-related feeds for themselves or their third parties are, one, the high level of noise and false positives in the data, which we help to eliminate by having them validated by threat analysts before they're delivered to the customer, and two, the opacity or black box nature of how the findings are derived. And our solution publishes each incident with a clear statement on why we are flagging that vendor. So, for example, host 1.2.3.4, which corresponds to your enrolled vendor, Foo Corporation, was highlighted at 12:27 this morning because this feed indicates, based on this evidence, that it has this infection with this botnet. There is no mystery, there is no black box, there is no opacity. And those incidents after human validation are published to a portal where they can be accessed via UI, via a REST endpoint that will allow you to pull the data into any tip, SIM, dashboard, GRC tool, or other system of your choice. And if you so desire, can be sent out in message format. You can receive notifications by email, and you can have a quick heads up, even sent by text message, with totally customized escalation procedures by type, by recipient, and even by time of day. If it's business hours, phone me. If it's not, send me a text, that sort of thing. The point is, we are very flexible because we understand we have to fit into a customer's existing workflows. There are already people who are already using tools to do processes they've already developed. You have to flow into those, not tell the customer they have to change how they do business to work with you. Frankly, as a vendor, that's a very important distinction. Finally, I think one of the discussions that will inevitably come up in a third-party risk monitoring program is, can we do it ourselves? Excuse me, what is the build versus buy? I can tell you after 18 years in this business that if we go back to that Venn diagram, the amount of storage and engineering, normalization of different document types, formats, languages, character sets, the tools and indexing to make that data accessible, the ability to overlay and parse out data that applies to the vendors, etc. There is a list of hundreds of detailed requirements for such a thing to work effectively. And frankly, there are customers who build a program, a tool, a platform, a workflow, user interfaces, processes, and staff to do exactly what they want, exactly the way they want it. I will tell you they are relatively few and far between, and they are at the very rich end of the spectrum. What a lot of customers either want or increasingly are required to do under regulations and emerging standards is to get something up and running quickly, that is effective, that is cost effective, and that eliminates a lot of the noise and work, because again, that constraint is fundamentally the people even more than it is the systems or the data or the budgets. So in closing, what I'll sum up, and I want to thank Nick again as we move to Q&A. I want to thank Nick for teeing this up so nicely. What he is hearing at his very big picture industry level and what I am hearing sitting with customers every day is essentially three things. I want high fidelity, low noise, ideally vetted and validated findings. Second, I need it as close to real time as possible. Annual doesn't work or weekly doesn't work when threats and risks are exposed at line speed, not calendar speed. Finally, I really am constrained on the human side. The value for many customers increasingly is in a managed service, not just a tool or a data stream that leaves all the work on the customer. I believe that if you can bring that to customers at a cost-effective price point, that's something that the industry, not only that will benefit us and other vendors like us, but will actually, and in some ways most importantly to me, benefit our clients who need a solution to this that works at an affordable cost. With that, Dina, I'll turn it over to you to start us off on the Q&A.
Fantastic, Eric. There are a few things that come through, so let's see. Let's go ahead and get to these. Here's the first one, and I'll let you chime in on this one, Eric. What do you see as the biggest differences between your managed service and the more automated rating or scorecard products?
I touched on a few of these during the flow of the conversation, but let me be very explicit about what those are. First, I think the scorecards and automated data services fill a very important role at their price point for a tier of vendors where that level of scrutiny and diligence is sufficient. So I am not for a moment suggesting they don't fill an important role. For the critical tier of vendors that have the most access or are touching your most sensitive information, I believe the distinctions that are important are as follows. First, a managed service provides a level of human vetting and management that the automated processes do not. Second, they provide a person you can talk to. We provide both a standard program manager level person, if you will, who can field questions and work with you. In some accounts, we even have dedicated on-site managers who work as an embed with our customers to help them follow an established procedure and communicate, engage, and liaise with their vendors to validate the findings are correct, which is a frequent complaint of the automated services, that the data is not always scrubbed properly. Engage and liaise with those vendors and see those things and track them through and track them to resolution. I think the third thing is this. A lot of those automated services cannot, by their very nature, incorporate sources of data that require human interpretation prior to processing. You have to read that underground forum, that hacker IRC channel. You have to interpret that string of characters in a domain name before you can say whether or not it constitutes a risk. And purely automated services simply have to omit those types of sources, which can be incredibly valuable.
Fantastic. Nick, feel free to chime in on any of these as we go through the list. I think some of these, it sounds like, are kind of pointed towards Eric's solutions. But Nick,
Yep.
if you have any feedback, would love to hear that as well. So
I will do so, yeah. Not too much to add there. I think it is a kind of a choice that the organization has to make itself when it comes to whether to go for managed services versus just having the technology solution. A lot should be, as much of a clear assessment of your own internal capabilities and expertise that you have to actually conduct some of the final reviews and assessments as well as the remediation.
Awesome. Okay, going through the list, here's another one that just came in. It says, do you recommend that clients actually use the intelligence you provide directly in conversations with their vendors? That's a good one.
That is a good one. I have spoken to customers who take absolutely polar opposite views of this question. So in one camp are the folks who say, absolutely, I'm going to sit down with my vendor and say, this LookingGlass report says you've got 657 compromised user accounts, 14 critical vulnerabilities in your key web applications, 3 long-term salady infections on workstations, and a partridge in a pear tree. The other camp says, oh no, I'm not telling them I have this report. I'm going to read it on the plane. I'm going to go to the site visit. I'm going to ask them lots of pointed questions, and they're going to go, I wonder why they're asking all of these very specific questions, but I'm never going to tell them about the report that's sitting in my briefcase. I don't actually have a parochial preference in this. I think it depends on the relationship between the enterprise and their vendor, the nature of the data and the services that they connect through or share. I certainly can argue either way that there are pros and cons to each one. What I will say is this, and this is where, again, I think a managed service or in our larger accounts, even that dedicated on-site resource can play a tremendous role. Unlike an automated report, which is often prone to incorrect findings and has no way to communicate with that vendor, whether I explicitly say I have this report in my hand or I don't tell them that, it's not just what's in the report. So if I say, hey, I know you have 38 compromised credentials that were all in this big breach that was found on the dark web last week, it's not just the 38 compromised users. That's 38 out of how many over the last 6 months? How many of those are recurring? If a user is in breach after breach after breach, does that indicate a long-term infection on their workstation? If that workstation has a long-term infection, is there a problem with your endpoint or antivirus? Do you reset passwords by policy because I'm seeing the same passwords over years? If you have that policy, do you have any way to enforce it? By the way, passwords are not strong passwords. Do you have a policy on that? My point is, it's not about the 38 things in the spreadsheet or the user accounts in the text file. It's about the conversation that they prompt with your vendor to actually reduce your risk, not just say, I completed the form.
Yeah, and just to add on, I completely agree, but I would also say the on-site reviews isn't sustainable. That's the key problem. That's why we're here discussing this, is because you can't get to every site. You can't review all of your third parties. Sure, you can do it for a select few, but how do you handle all of the others? And that's really getting to that point of scale. I don't have a problem with either approach, but it's definitely something that you'll have to consider once you get beyond your kind of tier one major vendors that you're going to always review in a very dedicated way. And even then, this information is helpful to make sure you're asking the right questions. But then beyond that, how you go about approaching it with vendors is definitely very tricky. It's something that comes up for customers that are that I've interacted with CISOs who have had really difficult, contentious conversations or interactions with their vendors. And in some cases, it's because the information, and this does happen where there is an issue that was already resolved, or there's some mistake in it. I'm not saying LookingGlass will find many mistakes. I'm just saying that it does happen with any service that you're going to get. And so giving them the option to show, here's what we have, here's where we think you need to really focus on, is a more kind of trusted way to work with your third parties. It's not holding information over their head. It's saying, look, this is where you are. This is where we need you to be. We want to do business with you, but we need your help.
I couldn't agree more, Nick. This, as I said, is about prompting an engaged, intelligent conversation with the vendor. We've even had folks come to us and say, and I think you touched on this, I want to onboard this vendor. I'm not trying to get in the way of procurement. What I'd like to do is just understand if I'm hitching my horse to a wagon with a problem, let's engage with them early. We've also had customers come to us confidentially about acquisitions and say, it's not going to change the deal, but we would like to know if you can, from an external viewpoint, if you can see problems or risks or vulnerabilities, then so could an attacker. And so it is about engaging in that intelligent
Verizon probably wish they did that for Yahoo, for example.
Very rightfully so. And Eric, that's perfect. That actually touched on a couple of the last questions that came in just recently. It talked about engaging before they onboard as a vendor. So I think you've already gone there, so that's great to hear. We are absolutely getting kind of close to time, so I'm going to go ahead and do a quick wrap-up. First of all, I want to definitely thank you, Nick. Appreciate your time, and Eric, you as well, as your insight for LookingGlass. Today, fantastic presentation. Audience members, thank you so much for attending and being on live with us. And just to let you know, there will be a recording of today's webcast that will be sent out to each of you, as well as a copy of the presentation slides. So if you came in late or you'd like to share this with anyone else within your organization, definitely do so. They'll be sent out by tomorrow. And also make sure, like I mentioned, there's some attachments and links there in the resources section. So we'll be on another minute or so, peruse through those, or you can reach out to us directly. And then as well, here we have right here on our final screen, we've got the contact information. You can reach out to us via social. There's also our website that's listed. So any additional questions, there's a couple others that came in late. We'll address those after the presentation itself. So feel free to reach out to us. And our next webcast will be on November 9th. Check our website. You can sign up for that one. But again, Nick and Eric, thank you both very much. Very insightful, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.